As you watch this video, your brain will be taking in a lot of information. And that's not just MCAT information. Sure, you'll be watching and listening to the video, but you'll also be taking in environmental factors, as well as body factors. These are all aspects of cognition. My name is Netta Bianchi, and welcome to the Kaplan MCAT Science Review video on cognition. We'll begin by delving into what cognition actually is, and then look at some of the models surrounding how cognition functions and how it develops. We'll end by looking at some factors that influence cognition. The learning goal for this video is to have you describe the stages of cognitive development and the factors that influence cognition. This learning goal will enable you to answer questions like the following about Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development. Cognition deals with how our brains sift through and deal with the enormous amount of information that's thrown at us from our environment. It involves everything from perception, attention, memory, problem solving, to reasoning, and much more. Our brain processes a lot of information, and we are constantly overloaded with experiences and sensations that lead to thoughts and processing in our brain. Essentially, our brain is sifting through what's important and what isn't to create knowledge and understanding. Simply put, inputs are being processed to lead to outputs. While many animals do have cognition, ours is the most complex, and that's explained by the fact that we have a large frontal lobe compared to our anthropological ancestors. As computers were popularized in the 1950s, psychologists began applying computer function concepts to describe how our brains are actually functioning. They theorized that it works much like a computer does, in that it encodes, stores, and retrieves information. This model has 4 key components or pillars, including thinking, analysis of stimuli, situational modification, and obstacle evaluation. Thinking involves how our brain deals with stimuli, including the sensation of those stimuli, encoding them, and storing them. In order for the stimuli to actually be useful in decision-making, they must be analyzed. Then, one situation can help us solve new problems as our brain adapts previous decisions to fit new situations. Finally, our brains evaluate obstacles to determine their context and complexity in order to problem solve. This theory, however, is just too simple to describe the large amount of work that the brain does. The brain does handle facts, but it also handles our emotions, sensations, and our memories. Therefore, our complex brain functioning can't be fully explained by the information processing model. Over our lifespan, we develop the ability to think through and solve our problems, which is called cognitive development. Jean Piaget, an influential psychologist, explained how our brains learn things. Piaget claimed that infants learn mainly through instinctual interaction with their environment. In early cognitive development, they master the physical environment, and as physical tasks are mastered, children move on to abstract thinking, which occurs throughout childhood. An example of early cognitive development is the grasping reflex. As an infant grows and interacts with his or her environment, he begins to touch things and attempt to hold them and grasp them. Through experience with this reflex, the infant learns that it's possible to grasp objects. And these organized patterns of behavior and thought are known as schema, and they create the basis of our cognitive development. Piaget theorized that new information is processed via an adaptation system, in which new information has to be placed into different schemata. Adaptation comes about with 2 processes. Assimilation is the process in which new information can be cleanly placed into existing schemata. So, a baby that's learned to grasp a bottle or a cup will easily learn how to grasp his or her baby bottle. Accommodation involves modifying the existing schemata in order to allow that new information to be placed into a schema. So, for example, a baby must accommodate to this new and strange shape of a baseball in order to grasp it. Piaget believed that children and adults have entirely different ways of thinking, and he proposed that there are 4 stages of cognitive development that people pass through continuously and sequentially in their lifetime, which means that completion of one stage prepares an individual for the following stage. The first stage is the sensor-motor stage, which begins at birth and lasts until about 2 years of age. In this stage, the child learns to alter his or her environment, usually to meet his own physical needs. There are 2 types of circular repetitive reactions that begin in this stage, primary and secondary. These circular reactions will alter the child's environment. Primary circular reactions tend to involve the baby meeting his or her own needs. These circular reactions are body movements that were initially just a chance occurrence. but they might be soothing to the child and thus are repeated. For example, a baby might have accidentally started sucking his thumb and realized that this was a soothing action and therefore continued to suck his thumb. Secondary circular reactions involve a child changing his or her environment, usually through an action that's focused outside of the body, and it elicits some kind of an environmental response. So for example, a child might throw toys from a high chair and watches his parents pick it up repetitively. While this might seem like a child's way of just annoying a parent, Piaget places this action under the cognitive development theory, as throwing toys repetitively is inducing a change in the external environment. The end of this stage is marked by the establishment of object permanence, which is the ability to identify that objects exist even when they're not in view. Perhaps the best example of this is the game Peekaboo. If you've ever tried to play Peekaboo with a 4-year-old, you might have been shrugged off by an uninterested toddler. The game Peekaboo is fun for infants in the early years of the sensory-motor stage because they haven't yet developed that idea of object permanence. So once a child establishes object permanence, he has something called representational thought. So even when an object isn't in view, he has a mental representation of it and knows that it exists. Piaget's preoperational stage of cognitive development begins at age 2 and ends around age 7. The main points here are that children have symbolic thinking, egocentrism, and centration. Symbolic thinking describes the development of an imagination and the ability to pretend. A child's drawings or artwork in school might represent this kind of symbolic thinking or imagination. The child also has egocentrism, where he or she is unable to understand what other people think or feel, and can really only think of themselves. Lastly, this stage is characterized by centration, where a child focuses on only one aspect of a phenomenon at any given time. This includes an inability to understand conservation, where parts are conserved after they're deformed. For example, imagine that a child in this stage is presented with 2 identical quantities of pizza. One is in 2 slices, and one is in 1 giant slice. The child will look at the number of slices on the plate rather than the overall quantity. So despite the fact that both plates have an equal quantity of pizza, the child will gravitate towards the plate that has 2 slices of pizza. The end of this stage, and the beginning of the concrete operational stage, is marked by a child learning conservation and understanding and considering other people's feelings, thoughts, and perspectives. The concrete operational stage lasts from about 7 years old to 11 years old, and in this stage, logical thought is used to analyze concrete objects and information. But the children have not yet mastered abstract ideas. For example, in this stage, a child would understand that if a piece of clay was flattened, it can be returned to its original shape. Also, if water is poured into a cup and then poured into a different vessel with the same shape, the child would be able to understand in this stage that the same amount of water exists despite being in a different vessel. This kind of logical thinking is then followed up in the formal operational stage with abstract thinking, which begins at 11 years old. Adolescence begins in this stage, which is marked by the children's ability to think logically or reason through abstract concepts and ideas. Piaget's pendulum experiment demonstrates how children can methodically reach a conclusion about a specific question. In this experiment, children were given a pendulum in which they could vary the length of the string, the weight of the pendulum, the force of the push, and the height of the swing. And they were asked, what determines the frequency of the swing? Children in the previous stage, the concrete operational stage, would just manipulate the variables at random, and they would even distort the data to fit their preconceived notion of what is true. But adolescents and children in this stage, the formal operational stage, would hold all of the variables constant except for one at any given point in time. So they were testing methodically to discover that only the length of the string affects the frequency. Keep in mind that the 4 stages of cognitive development are a theory proposed by Piaget, and therefore might not be the entire story. Nevertheless, Piaget's theory is an influential model of how cognition develops through adolescence. As individuals grow older, various cognitive changes occur. These changes can be described in terms of fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is the skills involved in solving problems and peaks around early adulthood. Crystallized intelligence, on the other hand, involves applying skills and knowledge that we've acquired, and peaks around middle adulthood. Both fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence decline with age, and this is a natural process. There are other forms of cognitive deterioration that occur that are beyond old age. Dementia is a very common and progressive intellectual decline. It often begins with impaired memory, but later progresses to impaired judgment, confusion, and even personality changes. The most common cause of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. In fact, 60–80% of all dementia cases are Alzheimer's. Individuals with Alzheimer's disease have significant deterioration in parts of their brain. There are various hereditary, environmental, and biological factors that can influence cognition. Many factors can overlap and simultaneously affect development. Environmental factors can include non-psychological causes, including electrolyte and pH disturbances, malnutrition, low blood sugar, infection, and many more, which can lead to delirium. Delirium is rapid fluctuation in cognitive function, and it's reversible and caused by medical non-psychological causes. For this reason, it should not be confused with dementia. Alcohol use or other drug use is another environmental factor that affects cognition, specifically in a fetus. Alcohol use during pregnancy leads to fetal alcohol syndrome, which manifests in the physical characteristics of the baby. For example, the baby might have a thin upper lip, a small eye opening, a short nose, and a low nasal bridge. Genetic factors can also influence cognition. These genetic factors can lead to everything from antisocial personality disorder to chromosomal conditions such as Down syndrome or trisomy 21, as well as Fragile X syndrome. Again, keep in mind that a variety of factors can be influencing cognition at any given point in time. Let's see how the topics in this video might be tested on the MCAT. Answer this practice question. The answer is B. Piaget's preoperational stage in cognitive development is characterized by an inability to understand the concept of conservation, where parts are conserved after deformation. Thus, Kristen believes that the 2 slices of bread have a higher quantity than the 1 slice intact, though both slices of bread are the exact same quantity. If you had trouble with this question, review Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development. Try your hand at this practice question. The answer is A. Carson has learned how to eat with a spoon utensil and has included it in his schema through adaptation. This particular question is testing the specific type of adaptation, of which there exist 2, assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation would have been the process of Carson learning how to eat with a spoon. Now that he's given a fork, a utensil that he has never seen before, Carson must accommodate this new utensil into his existing schema. He uses the information he processed when learning how to eat with a spoon and adjusts it to fit for the fork as well. If you had difficulty with this question, review Piaget's theory of adaptation. Let's look at some of the takeaways from this video. The information processing model creates a model on how the brain encodes, stores, and retrieves information. It creates an analogy between the brain and a computer. The cognitive development theory looks at how we think and solve problems, and features 4 stages: the sensor-motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. We explored these 4 stages in detail earlier in this video. Changes in cognition can occur through age, as fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence both decline as we get older. Other types of intellectual decline can occur beyond those of old age. Dementia is a very common progressive loss of cognitive function. Thank you for watching the Kaplan MCAT Science Review video on cognition. I wish you the very best of luck in your studies.